Welcome back as we continue the second season of the DDI podcast, where we are demystifying the misconceptions surrounding the digital infrastructure sector. I'm your host, Mark Yeeles, the Vice President for Schneider Electric's Secure Power Division here in the UK and Ireland. And today I'm delighted to host Penny Madsen, who is the Senior Research Director for Cloud and Edge Services and Worldwide Infrastructure Research at IDC, and one of the world's most recognised authorities on cloud computing. In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the biggest trends impacting the cloud space, including generative AI, and ask if we can make the cloud a more sustainable place. So, Penny, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let us kick off straight away. First question, straight in there. I wonder if you can help our listeners a little bit. Please, can you explain maybe a little bit more about your personal journey into the tech sector?
Yeah, definitely. So it started, I think like quite a few people, it started outside of tech. I was a journalist in Australia working for a newspaper and ended up eventually finding my way into ZDNet and working as a tech journalist many years ago. At the time when it was quite fun traveling around, going to America lots and Microsoft, etc. And then I came to the UK and ended up being an editor for about 13 titles, but a lot of them focused on either technology or engineering. And that gave me a grounding that led DCD to me to say, well, there's this thing called data centers. You know, there's a big element of engineering behind them, big element of tech behind them. Very few people know a lot about them. Will you come and work for us? So that got me into data centers, which I kind of stuck with for many, many years. I ended up moving from DCD to be an analyst at 451, covering co-location market and service providers. And it was super interesting, but I got quite interested in what was happening under the bonnet. And now I'm at IDC, where I run a product called Cloud Pulse. It's a survey where we go out quarterly up to 1,700 cloud buyers and ask what they're doing with cloud. And this is globally, how they're adopting cloud, but also what technologies are underneath this and what are they doing with their data centers as well. So we cover a lot of ground. And I'm really then working with the market, looking at actually what should be happening in this space to accommodate cloud, which is really, I missed out a part of my journey there because I was at CVRE and there we were identifying that just in Europe alone, 80% of the demand for data centers was actually from cloud.
I'm really interested. And what fascinates me when I host guests on this show is the diversity and different pathways on a career that you all go on. It's never really, the start point is nowhere near the end point, generally speaking. So fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let me just pick you up on one of those points, which was IDC. And it's written about how generative AI is powering a new era for tech and business. Essentially, we're now in the era of what feels like AI everywhere. How do you see that convergence of AI and the cloud taking place? What will this mean, do you think, for us moving forwards?
Yeah, and I mean, this is quite a big question to unpack. Let me start, first of all, with where IDC is coming from with this, because we're covering the journey to AI and everything that means pretty intensively right across the organization. And it's, you know, from an end user point of view, it's really about the augmentation and automation of work, but it goes much deeper than that. I mean, from a cloud perspective, it's something that public cloud providers and dedicated cloud providers and tech vendors just happen to be positioning everything in the right way when they're looking at hybrid cloud, for example. That really lends itself really well to delivering generative AI. But I think also the thing we have to remember about generative AI is that this is not just a vertical technology. So when we're looking at this, public cloud is just one area and dedicated cloud that generative AI is touching at IDC. It's actually horizontally touching every single aspect of technology that we're covering, I would say. That's how transformative this is. If we want to look at what's happening in the cloud market or to the cloud providers, which is really interesting if you're a data center provider out there, for example, catering to these guys as your customers, well, it's changing their business quite a lot. It's changing the way that they deliver services. And it's also changing the way that companies sort of access software and what they're doing with software as well and applications. There will be myriad offerings out there. For example, we see so many different approaches to how public cloud providers are leveraging the way that they were already established to be able to quickly deliver Gen AI capabilities. But we also see changes in things like software itself and the way that things right down to that level are going to have to be built. So we we ask a question pretty regularly about how many applications are deployed, whether applications that are being deployed are applications that are being refitted, re-architected, or new applications going into the cloud, for example. We've seen a slight decrease actually in the last time we asked this about the ones being refitted and re-architected, and we were asking why. Then we started to get answers back from across the IDC team that actually there's a lot of companies now having to rethink how they do applications, because is it worth refitting or re-architecting an application when you might be able to buy one with Gen AI capabilities with it? So I think there's a huge change that just shows how much this isn't just an infrastructure consideration. It goes right down to the very applications, and cloud providers are having to cater to that. And we do ask companies, the cloud buyers, what their main route to Gen AI is going to be. And I've got to say, we've got a very large percentage of organizations, I think it's like 80% or so, are saying that Gen AI is highly important to them at the moment. The main route to actually getting to those deployments is going to be primary cloud providers first and hyperscale partners. So they are looking to whoever is their main cloud provider, and that can be a technology vendor as well, if you think about HP or Dell, etc. And then it's the primary tech vendors that they might have. So if they may not necessarily have a cloud relationship, but they've got a technology relationship with somebody as well. So cloud is playing a pretty big role in this. Looking at the cloud buyers. Now, cloud buyers, we find already that in this last year, 73% of companies that already have a cloud are looking to transform that cloud. So the opportunity is there massively for cloud providers to step in and work with these companies, but it means that there's a huge amount of shifts happening with the infrastructure. I think it was around about half, there was a pretty high percentage of that infrastructure of the cloud is going to change for a lot of these companies. The average amount of time that's going to happen is within 2 years. So that just highlights the challenge that's going to be there. I will say that when we start to look at the most important cloud environment itself, we know the providers companies might be working with, but those providers will provide a mix of on-premise, dedicated cloud, public cloud. The focus at the moment is really on public cloud. It's about getting that speed to market. It's huge costs, and as you can imagine, probably building out a dedicated cloud for these environments. But dedicated cloud, which is private cloud, comes in next. And then non-cloud, those traditional environments, is pretty far behind. So it just shows that when it comes to Gen AI, the market's really going to be focusing on leveraging providers to deliver this. Colo factors in. We ask companies where models and workloads will be placed, and the number one environment for those is Colo. So think about this as a hybrid play. While companies are thinking about those environments for, putting things into public, they're still going to have stuff very hybrid in what would be their on-prem environment, which might be inside co-location as well, where they can get on-ramps to cloud. And we actually find already that 20% of companies getting public cloud services are actually doing so from within the same data center. So there's already a bit of groundswell there as well.
Wow, you're right. It was a deep question, wasn't it?
Yeah.
With a detailed answer.
Yeah.
So I think one thing we can say, there's a transformational change taking place. And I think you gave us some timescales there of 2 years, possibly up to maybe 3 and 4, just to get that infrastructure right for Gen I and the future.
2 years might be the goal, but we always know these things are likely to overrun quite a bit. I think there'll be a number of inhibitors. Cost might be one as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, something we might talk about a little bit later is labor and resource to make it a reality and make it happen. Could also be a little bit challenging. Let me pick your brains on this piece then. So your research has found that cloud can be a foundational choice for businesses and consumers with many, many tangible benefits. In your opinion, what are the benefits of cloud computing, and how do you see the cloud maybe evolving in the future?
Yeah, so the cloud's always evolving, really, isn't it? With every iteration of technology and demands, and AI proves that. But let me start with the general benefits, because I think these are important to recognize, because we're definitely starting to see a tipping point for those companies as well that are broad adopters of cloud. There's particular benefits that they have that other organizations now don't. So we can actually quantify what some of the benefits of doing cloud might be. There's actually, more proof in the market based on how organizations can operate when they're doing cloud. But I think the biggest thing is with cloud, and this is public and dedicated cloud, because remember, the dedicated cloud providers are now building ecosystems. They're now having a range of services built into things and partnerships that enable multi-cloud. So it's really the access to a wide range of services. We know that everybody's trying to right fit those application deployments, put things in a location where it might be best able to perform, more efficient, which I know we're going to touch on sustainability later. But I think all those benefits of being able to have something where we know that companies were selling their data centers and offloading those CapEx environments, moving more to OpEx or going into colo. But I think, there's additional benefits when companies start to go, well, we've got an operation in Germany. Let's place something here for residency. Let's place something in Eastern Europe for performance requirements, etc. But I think the other thing that we're seeing now is really a lot of those organizations that have gone down that path are seeing specific industry benefits as well. Being able to gain access to industry specific applications and tools and build ecosystems around those vertical markets, which the cloud providers have been working on for quite a while now. I think there's also, you mentioned the skills challenge. I mean, if you've got somebody else operationally handling your cloud, you can overcome that. But if you've also got providers that wrap services around, and that's a big money spinner for a lot of these hyperscalers as a professional services element of this, and the partners that work in this whole space. And we see more and more that I think there's a large number of companies, even if they build their own cloud, will turn to a third party to actually help them manage that cloud. So I think it's access to the skills and the knowledge that comes with that. When we start to look at new technologies like generative AI, for example, it's also the access to the latest technologies you can get. So it's going to be the hyperscalers that have the economies of scale to be able to actually buy more and more of the equipment that might be newest on the market, the latest iteration of chips, etc., that will be needed to power some of these new workloads. And you can get that as a service. I did some work maybe last year or the year before. I was speaking with companies that were doing AI add-on edge environments, and it was highly critical to a lot of the work they were doing. And they were having to bank a lot of the technology because of some of the supply chain challenges that were in the market, for example. And they were spending huge amounts of money getting these servers in that they might need that were just going to sit dormant until they had to use them. And it might be in the next year or so, but their real fear was that the next iteration of technology would have released before they'd even get the chance to use these things. And then they'd need to be using that additional performance that they'd get. So I think cloud overcomes a lot of those things, but it's definitely not without its challenges. It can be very complex. There's definitely challenges right through with security. I think the biggest new challenge that I'm seeing is really the network and performance. And we're seeing a lot of companies deploy in cloud, then finding that they're overspending because the network costs have gone up, or they haven't been factored in enough, or they're having data egress costs. There's definitely a lot of those challenges. But I think for companies that have worked their way around that, we see, as I mentioned, that real tipping point. There's real advantages to actually being a broad user and familiar user of cloud. When it comes to those broad adopters, we find that 10% tend to be further ahead with their business goals and what their business can achieve in terms of digital transformation. And there's also a lot of technical benefits. And we find that 10% grows to 20% ahead if those companies are already doing hybrid and multi-cloud. Some of those organizations are saying we can now focus more on customer experience. We're focusing more on innovation, data analytics, and scalability. And you think about what that means when it comes to deploying something like Gen AI and the advantage those companies then might have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I'm hearing here is the opportunity also brings with it some challenges. And what we need to solve those are probably the uptick in skills. I'm definitely hearing a little piece of that from you there, Penny. And also the bringing together of the ecosystem to help solve, because I think you've given, a good steer there on, how cloud can play its role, but actually the tech sits in all parts of cloud, both up, down, but also verticalized as well. So there is an ecosystem play here as well, isn't there?
Oh, massively, massively. I think we ask companies, and we class an ecosystem is a pretty broad term as well. So how would you define that? Would you define an ecosystem? And I think it can be any one of these things to companies that are doing cloud. So it can be an Equinix ecosystem, where it's companies coming together and connecting, or a digital realty ecosystem. It could be an internet exchange ecosystem. We're seeing more of that to overcome costs. It can be an ecosystem, a channel ecosystem with partners and specific arrangements through more traditional looking ecosystems, or you can have those peer-to-peer ecosystems as well. And I think in today's age, and we'll see this more with Gen AI, you're going to have more companies developing apps themselves that their peers might be using, or that they might be actually selling back into the market. So I think the whole notion of ecosystem is really important. And to me, the piece of technology that really comes in then as being the most integral with that is the connectivity piece. And as I said, that's one of the next big challenges, is really that network challenge that a lot of organizations have. And I think, years ago, a lot of companies got rid of their network teams. But I think that's definitely a skill that's going to come back to the fore.
Well, let's watch this space on that piece for sure. IDC, the kind of 2023 CloudOps survey, it's said and found that 42% of decision makers cited the cloud as very critical or extremely critical in achieving their sustainability objectives. Interesting. Can we make the cloud more sustainable? And in your view, which organizations are leading the way on sustainability?
The CloudOps survey is not mine, so I'm not familiar with all of those figures, but we do ask a lot about sustainability in Cloud Pulse. And we sometimes come at it from a different ilk as well. But we do find that 81% of cloud buyers, and this is globally, have pretty strong requirements of their suppliers now. And these are cloud suppliers. And by cloud suppliers, we're including anybody delivering cloud, from managed service providers through to tech vendors, etc. They have to show requirements for sustainability. Now, I've been privy to RFPs in the past where sustainability might be, do you have access to renewable power? Do you have a green data center? Are you considerate of sustainable options? There's just some really basic tick boxes. And what we're starting to see is that change. We're starting to see some really clear criteria start to come up on what is required for companies to be sustainable, or cloud providers. So they're wanting all those things, the green DCs, but I think a lot of that and the low PUEs, all of that is kind of a given that companies are going to be going down that path, particularly the newer the data center that they operate. But we're actually starting to see more companies now ask for innovation roadmaps for efficient compute. They're wanting to see companies say, we're actually looking at delivering everything that we do right down to the network, where the costs are involved, right down to the servers, right down to the applications, building software with sustainability in mind. And this is what we've got on our roadmap. And this is where we're going with this. The other thing they really want is tools that they can themselves track sustainability, because that's still what's missing across the market. There's still no real clear guidance on how you can actually track and measure sustainability in the right way that's blanket across the market. And if you start to get organizations that are doing multi-cloud and managing hybrid clouds, etc., you can imagine it gets very complex, and you can end up having many different tools to actually do this same role right across. When it comes to cloud, I think there's always the given that you're going to get the economies of scale that the hyperscalers do. So they do this very, very well. The hyperscalers, they haven't done it with sustainability in mind, I would say, unless they've been forced to do it. A lot of this is cost efficiency as well, but they have had the resources to invest in renewables. Of course, if you go to a cloud, if you're doing Gen AI, for example, you can use a shared resource such as GPUs. And it means that you've got less idle equipment sitting there, taking on power, for example, as we know. You can also fit applications to best locations. Now, that's not happening enough, but I think there'll be advancements in things like automation that will enable more of that. You can also right-size the type of compute you might be using. The latest iterations of technology as well, which is incredibly important when you think about all the efficiency that's coming in new chip designs, new server designs, etc. So I think that's how the hyperscalers can do this. But I do think, we will see more data centers built in colder locations, with the likes of HPE GreenLake doing supercomputing, locations that were typically for cold storage that are now being looked at for other use cases. We have investments in renewable plants still happening. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these big data center providers can actually impact the new markets they go into as well. We know that countries are saying to these providers, you have to be renewable. You're going to use all our water, you're going to use all our power. But when they go into markets that are predominantly coal-based, they can actually influence what those new emerging markets might be doing in their own power mix too. And I think that can be a pretty influential factor in terms of changing the tide and how some of these markets look at sustainability.
Yeah, and I think we've seen quite a few examples of this, notably in the Nordics, haven't we? Just on that topic that you mentioned just there. And I think we're all trying to find different and creative ways to think how we can do this a little bit different to benefit. I'll use the term ecosystem, but it is the sustainability ecosystem when we look at that. I can say that I think you mentioned RFQs earlier. I think we're seeing more and more of our potential customers start to talk about circularity, start to talk about the whole ESG topic in general, even down to things like embedded carbon within some of our products. We're definitely seeing a mind shift, I think, from a manufacturer's point of view as well. So it's been very interesting. Let me bring us on to another topic then. So you've spoken before about how sustainability must coincide with the greater costs, energy and operational efficiencies, if it's to be truly embraced by business. Do you mind just going into maybe a little bit more detail, share some of your thoughts with us on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you guys have been having conversations with companies about sustainability. We see it popping up in the cloud conversation. But for example, when we ask companies that are doing generative AI, only 40% said they're concerned by the amount of energy it will consume. This actually drops to 34% in Western Europe. We also found that when we asked about sustainability and how much of a concern it was, when we started to get inflationary pressures into the mix, we saw our concerns go down. We saw sustainability, particularly in markets like North America. We really had a massive shift in thoughts around sustainability. I think a lot of it was a nice to have. But what companies don't really understand yet with sustainability, I don't think what's not marketed enough is really the fact that in most cases, sustainability is the same as cost efficiency. So if you are saving and doing things in a more efficient way, you're actually coming out with sustainable outcomes as well in most cases by actually right sizing, right fitting, looking at things, using less energy, for example. And I think there's a lot of that messaging still needs to be married up right across the market. I also think there's a lot of tools that need to be worked on to be able to do that. Tools like automation. We still need to be building AI into these things so we can actually more dynamically do some of these roles, because the management side of this, it can be so complex, and building FinOps tools that cover more of the market and provide more output and more observability and insight. I think they're going to be some of the really important developments that will help drive some of these sustainability initiatives. Because right now, everybody's just been told, we need Gen AI, we need it done. It needs to be done in the next 12 months. I think we'll have a point where I'm already hearing lots of companies going, oh yeah, we've put proof of concepts together, projects out there, and we've just hit our head against the wall when we've realized how much it's going to cost. So that's the inroads to go, okay, well, here's a more efficient way of doing this. Let's go down there and, you can build sustainability into that conversation.
Well, I think that's fascinating. And yeah, building sustainability into the conversation is exactly what we've been trying to do at Schneider Electric, actually, with some of our potential clients and clients, just to see how we get best optimized plants. And we'll continue to do that over the next period. And of course, to help us navigate our way through Gen AI and Gen AI in a more optimized way, we're going to need some different skills, aren't we? So what skills do you think we need to sort of power that piece in the cloud? And are you seeing, is that skills gap growing in your mind? And, what could we do you think, as an industry, to encourage more young people, maybe into the tech sector in general, actually?
Yeah, I've got to admit, I'm not an expert in this area. We've got a few experts who've been looking at the skills challenge pretty head on at IDC. But from where I sit, it's really interesting because we have just had some really high profile layoffs across the industry, large scale layoffs. And this includes in cloud teams with people that were seemed highly important over the last few years. And I'm pretty sure we'll get to a point where people need to be rehired again as well. A lot of the emphasis really should be on reskilling and shifting, because the market's changed so rapidly. And I feel like even when I look around at the different skill sets that are out there, there's a real broad array of options somebody starting out in this market could choose. And, your whole career is based on whatever development language you do or whatever course you might end up taking and where that takes you. And then you want to be sure of the job security at the end of that as technology changes. I think the thinking has to go now that this isn't a job for life, but it's a career where you're constantly retraining and reskilling and learning new skills at the moment. And I think I think that's where the emphasis has to be. And that dynamic nature of the role has to be what's put across to graduates entering as well, which you'd imagine should actually appeal to a lot of them today as well. They're not necessarily out there looking for the golden pension. They're looking for rewarding careers that can really help change things in the world. And I think that's how it's going to happen. We see that with DevOps, for example. But I think there's also a lot of internal pressures in a lot of organizations. We see faster delivery times for projects with smaller teams. And, it would be quite easy to also get a bit of burnout from these careers as well. And I think retention can be a problem across the industry. So I think that also needs to be addressed by a lot of these companies. And I think maybe this is where the hyperscalers or others don't lead so well. It's not about building the biggest teams, but maybe the smarter teams so that you can retain those skills at the same time.
Yeah, I think some fascinating insights there, actually, Penny. And I think if I couple the attraction of our industry, as I've mentioned to you previously, I've been in this industry 10, 11 months now, and we have very similar challenges in this sector than in previous sectors I've worked in, and in maybe life science and food and beverage. It's almost a mirror image. And actually, what we've seen and what we've found within our own organisation is that if you couple technology and the drive towards decarbonisation for an early career, you get a subscriber because they want to have an impact, but they want to have an impact through tech. And I take your point completely on perhaps the PR needed to be done on how exciting this industry is, because it is a solving agent to tackle some of the most challenging topics we've got in the world, never mind just in the data center industry. So thank you for your insight there. Final question here. Future gazing. Wow, we're going to look into a crystal ball. In your opinion, what do you think will be the next disruptive force for cloud compute? And how do you think it's going to affect maybe people in general or maybe businesses more broadly?
Well, I think AI, we're kind of 5 minutes into a marathon. Not even that, I'd say. But I feel like that is going to be the focus for a lot of companies they'll have their typical challenges, and AI is not going to answer everything, but I'm not talking just generative AI. I'm talking about AI that's going to enable more efficient operations inside the data center, management of cloud, etc. I think that's going to be a real focus for organizations, and it's really going to change those job roles within the organization. It's going to change reporting, but it's going to throw up a whole heap of questions as well, particularly when we start to look at the generative AI side of that. So I actually think maybe the next transformational thing is not going to be a technology, but it's going to be regulation. Like we saw with GDPR, that changed the way companies looked at data centers and had to deploy data centers. New regulations around AI are going to completely change how companies look at their data, taking it a layer down, where they house that data, what they do. It's going to form a basis for the new services that the industry will be able to offer, because at the moment we can do everything. It's kind of like with GDPR, but how far can you stray from having stuff done in a sovereign way? How far can you stray towards doing this without possibly being impacted, having your infrastructure investments impacted by regulation that might be handed down? I'd like to say FinOps will make a change. I think that observability across the market, it'll make a change to how all of this is run and the operations inside the data center. I think there's still a lot of development to go on there. And I'm going to say then following that, there'll probably be some very high profile security breaches and companies will start having to look at quantum, but don't ask me how that's going to work.
Okay, then we'll pause at that point. So, Penny, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think we've talked about so many different topics. I've made a few notes here around the future of Gen I. What does the future actually of cloud look like? What skills are we going to need? Where are the gaps? How do we maybe solve some of those challenges? We've also spoken about the dawn. As you say, we're 5 minutes into a marathon here. This is, what's that going to mean for sustainability and, drive towards carbon net zero in our industry? And I think more broadly is how do we get that skill set built up at pace to be able to deliver at pace? Penny, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to talk to me today and sharing all your insights with our listeners. So thanks for joining the show.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.